Trends Forum. I'm very, very glad to see so many people here. My name is Bryan Alexander. I'm going to be your MC for the next hour. I want to welcome back people who were here last week for Audrey Waters, and I want to welcome new people who haven't been here before. You're in the Shindig environment, and I'll explain a little bit about that in just a second. Christopher and team, if you could advance the slide, please. What you're seeing is a project of the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. That's a monthly report, which is an environmental scan looking at trends longitudinally and through the news and immediate environment. It's been going on for a few years. You can find it online at ftt.us. And what you're experiencing today and for the next few weeks is a live version of that, where we're experimenting with talking with people to get their take on future trends in technology and education. Next slide, please, Chris. Future Trends in Technology and Education is generously sponsored by NYSERNet, New York State Educational Network. We're very glad for their sponsorship. And speaking of sponsors, next slide, please. The technology they're using is generously provided by Shindig, which is not only providing the physical and digital platform that we're using right now, but also very generously providing human support and a lot of scheduling infrastructure. So we're very, very grateful to Shindig for all of their help. Next slide, please. Now, today we're going to be talking with Rich DeMillo. We're looking at the future of education and how education changes under the impact of numerous forces, including technology. Every week, we discuss these topics with a practitioner, a visionary, an expert, someone who we just find to be terribly interesting and important. And Rich DeMillo is no exception to this. He's currently the executive director at Georgia Tech's Center for 21st Century Universities. He's also the chair of computer science and professor of management there. One of the reasons that we brought him in is because he's been working very hard on a fascinating hybrid master's degree program in computer science, but also because he is an author of several very provocative books. And let me just recommend Abelard to Apple, which came out a few years ago, and also Revolution in Higher Education. I'll be able to see my Kindle copy right here, which came out last year and which we've been online reading of through my blog. I find Rich to be a very, very stimulating, provocative, and surprising thinker, as well as practitioner in the field of technology and education, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Now, keep in mind that the way the setup works is we have the two of us will be on stage, and Chris, if you could bring Rich on the stage, please. We'll be hogging the limelight. We'll be talking, and you'll be seeing our smiling faces and our gestures as we go. We also have a chat box. So if you would like to be able to add to the conversation, and we very much want you to, please chat like so. So just to get things rolling, if you could take a minute and just say a couple of words about who you are and or where you are. As we go for the next hour, please contribute to the chat box. We'll be watching it very, very carefully. We're very keen to see your discussion, to see your thoughts, your reflections, your pushbacks, your arguments, your howls of outrage, and your cheers and examples. We're also going to be monitoring TweetDeck so that if there are any possible comments that come up there, we'll bring them in. For the first roughly 35, 40 minutes, this is going to be Rich and I going back and forth. And after that, along the way, we'll bring in your comments and suggestions. So, Rich, welcome to Future Trends Forum.
Hey, Brian, thank you.
Glad to see you. We're very, very glad to have you on board. As someone who's been following your work for several years, it's very nice to meet you. Well, if not in person, then the next best thing.
This is pretty close.
It is. And I'm speaking to a computer scientist who has the best informed opinion one could want. What I'd like to do is start off talking about Revolution in Higher Education, which I think is a very important, very provocative book. Very accessible and exciting book. I commend everybody on this conversation. And what I'd like to do is to ask you some questions based on our reading of it. And I'd like to see how you can riff on them.
Okay.
My first question is, thinking about digital learning and digital teaching. A major theme of your book, and I think perhaps the central theme, is the use of digital technologies to broaden access to American higher education. Well, how can we change digital teaching so that that broadens access to a larger audience? And right now, we're very successful in connecting online learning to professionals and self-taught autodidacts. How can we change the way we do teaching online so that it reaches a bigger audience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm always torn when we start talking about who currently benefits from digital learning and digital teaching, because it's hard for me to project out much beyond where we are right now. We're at the very early stages of this, and I think when we talk about digital learning, I'm making a break in history here between the kinds of things that we saw in the 90s or even before, and what happened from 2012 on. So there was this explosion that I call the magic year in the book, and it's hard to know what the constituency actually is. For every analysis that says these are post-professional people that are coming to MOOCs, or these are people that are self-motivated, there's a corresponding story which says this is a high school kid in rural Georgia that doesn't have access to a chemistry lab, or doesn't have access to a foreign language teacher that's getting on and replacing assets that should have been available in the university. So I want to talk a little bit about exactly who is benefiting from this, but just as a marker, I don't think I'm ready to accept the fact that these are digital natives, autodidacts, whatever the characterization is. I think we simply don't know at this point.
Well, it's a really good answer. And I do want to point again that you refer to the people who started off in Magic Year, Sebastian Thrun and Michael Crow and others as the revolutionaries. Um, I just want to press on this a little bit harder, not necessarily at the institutional level, but perhaps at the level of curriculum and pedagogy. Is there anything that academic programs, departments, and individual practitioners can do that how can they change their teaching with technology to make it more accessible?
Well, I make a big deal in the book about mastery learning, and the reason I do that is that it's one of those elephants that's been in the room for 30 years. We know that if we don't sit students in front of a sage on a stage for 50 minutes at a time, and we engage them in some process of assessment and personalized instruction, that everyone's performance goes up, everyone's achievement levels goes up. And there's this great quote at the end of Benjamin Bloom's classic paper, which acknowledges this and then says, it's this really sad ending to a technical paper, which says, of course, no society can afford to do this. And the jumping off point for my analysis is that we now have a pathway forward that takes the burden off providing that kind of personalized instruction. So my first reaction is, let's just do the stuff that we know works. We know that active learning is an enhancement to learning. Let's do that. We know that formative assessment has massive impact on achievement. Let's do that, and let's absorb the cost that it takes to do that by making use of the technology.
That last point is a real killer, because this is more expensive. And Bloom's argument, if I remember correctly, is that we can't afford to do this because we can't afford to have a tutor for every human who wants to learn. But
Right.
Your argument is that we can have something close to it if we structure the technology correctly, pedagogically, and then also use it so that we can do this without breaking the bank. Yeah, that's a huge claim. And
Yeah, so I think that's where that's where I see this going initially. And there's two ways to approach this. One is the technology as a kind of 21st century broadcast television, and that probably has some advantages and some adherence. But I would prefer not to do that. I would prefer to start with a sound set of pedagogical principles and build up to the technology that you need in order to do that in a cost-effective way, in an effective way, in an accessible way.
I was going to ask about MOOCs later on, but maybe this is a good point to jump in. I really like your distinction between, in my notes, I've just jotted this down as TV pedagogy versus sounder principles, say TV pedagogy versus active learning. That sounds like it maps really neatly onto the distinction that some have made between what others call X MOOCs and C MOOCs. And if you guys all on this conference haven't heard these terms, let me just quickly explain. X MOOC stands for the EDX model, or the Stanford model, where you have a very, very large MOOC of hundreds of thousands of learners. The emphasis is on content pushed out, interacted with. So it's often video recordings and exercises that are often either automated or self-assessed. And the interaction between students is relatively rare and not very satisfying. Question boards. Opposed to the X MOOC would be a C MOOC. C can stand for Canadian or Connectivist, and that is a smaller scale, often 1,000 or fewer. And the emphasis is on using social media to build a conversation in a constructivist way, so that most of the content of the class actually consists of discussion among participants. Examples of the latter would be, say, the Phonar MOOC on digital photography from Britain, the original MOOC, the Connectivist MOOC from Siemens and Downs, or the DS-106 MOOC series out of the University of Mary Washington. So C MOOC, no one likes those terms, but it's kind of the best we have. But does that map onto the pedagogical differences you're discussing?
So I mean, because I started thinking about MOOCs before we had this phylogeny of MOOCs. I really interpreted the word massive in MOOC as scalable, and to me, I keep coming back to what's important about the way we're utilizing the technology, and the way that we're utilizing the technology here at Georgia Tech, and I think in a lot of places that are thinking along the lines, is it removes physical constraints. So when we invest in a series of courses for the introductory engineering sequence, for example, what I have in the back of my head is a full classroom, and what can we do by taking that full classroom out of the picture and telling students, you're free to take this. Our students, Georgia Tech students, you're free to take this course when you need it, without regard to whether a section is filled or not. And so, if you just do that, there's a bunch of technologies that you have to sort of face head on. You can't assume that a Google Hangout is going to be useful for a collaboration medium, because you can only fit so many people in a Google Hangout. You can't assume that there's going to be a single instructor that grades every 10-page term paper in a class with 600 students in it. You can't do that. Those are not scalable. Those are not scalable things. But those are exactly the things that impact even a residential place like Georgia Tech. And I think what we're seeing with the successes, the initial successes of some of these online programs, is that people have become really creative about what exactly does it mean to be scalable in this environment. I have some examples that we can talk through later on, but just to kind of fix your mind and where I think this is going. We have a Physics 101 MOOC. This was a MOOC that we developed for the Gates Foundation. And what we've done is we filled this virtual classroom with all kinds of students. Some of them look very much like Georgia Tech freshmen. Some of them look like high school students scattered around the world. Some of them actually are high school students that show up on the Georgia Tech campus in the summer. But we haven't tried to recreate the experience of a physical classroom.